from a defabricated garden shed in Rockland County, New York, USA. This is Stand Up with Pete Dominic. On today's episode, ways to save on your electricity bill because that new Arctic Ready jacket won't pay for itself. And now, the podcast host who can't wait to show you his new seasonal fashion statement, Pete Dominic!
Thank you, Pico. That's right. My seasonal fashion statement, I want to liberate a truth here, is that I wear a nightcap. That's right. It's cold. I'm a bald man. People don't know, but hair keeps your head warm. But I don't have any, and so my head gets cold, and so I wear a nightcap, a kerchief, if you will. And this year, I'm going to put a hook by my bed so that I can put it up every night and then put it back on before I go to sleep. What I'm struggling with is what kind of nightcap I'm going to buy. It needs to be soft. It needs to be loose. It needs to be like it's not even there, just keeping my dome warm. So that is my seasonal fashion statement. I look forward to your ideas and suggestions. If there are other bald men out there that have the answer, you let me know. I mean, maybe you use heat in your houses. We don't really. So, yeah, I got to get a new nightcap. Maybe that's something you can send me as a gift. Huh, folks? Come on, hook a brother up. Hook your pal Pete up with some nightcaps. A kerchief, if you will. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's episode of Stand Up. I've got two great guests for you. Bill B. in D.C. Bill Boyle joins me to talk about the latest in Ukraine, the triumph by the Ukrainian military and leadership to overcome the monster that is Russia's invasion. Really important and, I think, good news there as well. We had a great conversation. I think you're really going to like it. And it's been far too long since I talked to Jared Yates Sexton. He joins me. Always great with him. Both those conversations are coming up. Jared starts at about 13 minutes, and Bill and I start our conversation at about 55 minutes if you want to fast forward to either of them. First, congratulations to HBO's Last Week Tonight, which won the Emmy for Best Late Night Comedy Show. I don't even know what the category is. Variety talk show? You know, it was up against Colbert and The Tonight Show and Jimmy Fallon, or Jimmy Kimmel, rather, and more, I guess. And they won. And I think that that's great because I work on that show every Saturday. I have a small role, but I think I should have gotten the Emmy myself as the audience warm-up comedian. Very excited that all of my friends at Last Week Tonight, many of which flew out to LA for the Emmy Awards, won the Emmy for Best Show. Their seventh consecutive series Emmy, surpassing The Late Show with David Letterman. Oh, here it is. It's Best Variety Talk Series. Wow, seventh year in a row. I didn't even mention the other nominee, Daily Show with Trevor Noah. Okay, so that's pretty exciting news. And other than that, I don't have anything to say about the Emmy Awards last night. Did you watch them? I don't know. I just heard about that. Listeners told me, and I'm proud to be a part of that. The smartest, funniest show on TV. If you're ever in New York and you want tickets, I could probably hook you up with a couple. So email me, standupwithpete@gmail.com. Well, today was crazy, and I had a ton of responsibilities to both the girls and a lot of work to get done, and also did both of these interviews. So I didn't get a lot of time to scan media and pull clips, but thanks to Barrett Coles, longtime listener, for sending me this TikTok from a TikTok creator called @goodtrouble_. He's got like 1 million followers. I'm not big on TikTok. I'm trying to figure out how to post my own stuff. I just posted a thing of Mara and I am @Pete.Dominic if you want to follow me on TikTok. But Barrett sent me this guy reacting to, apparently there's a controversy over a live action production of Disney's The Little Mermaid, where the main character is being played by a black actress, and people, I guess some people, I hope it's not a lot of people, are outraged, but the fact that anybody is outraged, here's the Daily Beast headline: the racist backlash to The Little Mermaid is out of control. Now, this is not a very important or consequential story to the world right now with all that's going on, but I thought this was such a good piece of commentary. It made me laugh, so I thought I'd share it.
Well, those were the comments on the Disney movie's trailer for the live-action Little Mermaid movie that's coming out. And it seems that the choice to cast a black actress to play Ariel has really upset a very small amount of people. And I would just like to unpack this for a second. Among the very racist comments, obviously, there were some that were just like, why can't you just create a new character? This character should be true to the original. The Little Mermaid is not a fucking documentary. She's a fish person. Her dad is the king of the ocean. He carried a fork. There was a witch with octopus legs. She can be fucking purple in real life. We don't know. But here's the real issue, and I want you to buckle in for this, white people. When you see this happening and you get upset, and it's because that you see this character whom you could connect with before, that you grew up with, and if you see this person portrayed as somebody else, and you have this feeling like, oh, I'm not going to be able to connect with this person on such a deep level as I was, or my kids aren't going to be able to connect with them, I want you to sit with that feeling for 2 seconds. And think about it. That's right. That's how other people feel when they go view movies that they aren't represented in. That's why representation is so important. And why also fresh take on this movie is fucking super good. You idiots.
I just love that. I thought that was really funny. Thank you, Barrett, for sending that to me. Send me anything you're hearing that I can share with folks listening to the show. I always appreciate it. That was great. All right, here's another thing. Here's the Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer of New York, on the Senate floor, the Senate back in session, talking about why it's important to protect marriage equality, codify marriage equality right now before the MAGA-controlled Supreme Court steps in. Here he is, the Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer.
And, of course, Judge Thomas has opened the door for the court to go even further backward when he's saying that cases like Obergefell, which protect marriage equality for now, should be revisited. So when some Republicans say, oh, this is unnecessary, it won't happen, remember, that's the same thing they said about Roe. And look at where we are today. We should protect marriage equality now, well before the MAGA-controlled Supreme Court steps in. So I encourage my colleagues to continue these conversations. The American people support protecting marriage rights of same-sex marriages by a large margin. So let's get it done.
There you go. Now he is saying the MAGA-controlled Supreme Court. How about that? Very interesting to hear the Senate Majority Leader use that kind of rhetoric, and a really important moment for the U.S. Senate. Hopefully they can get that done, although it doesn't seem likely with the current makeup of the Senate, which is why we desperately have to make sure that Democrats can maintain control of it. So do whatever you can in your states and let us know how we can help you. All right, I did find something from the Emmys. Legendary screenwriter and producer Shonda Rhimes on gender equality in TV at the Emmys last night.
For women in television, the journey to true representation has been a frustrating one, and we still have far to go. Now, creating television that features women as they truly are is not a difficult task. It's also not a magical act of benevolence when it happens. We are, after all, the majority of the population. True representation is our right. As Gina has said to me, it is just plain common sense, and she has the research to back it up.
Yeah, there you go. I think they're honoring Gina Davis in that moment, the actress Gina Davis. Here's comedian Bowen Yang joking at the Emmy Awards.
Oh, and I loved White Lotus, but murder isn't the worst thing that can happen at a resort. You know what it is? What the FBI did to my president at Mar-a-Lago.
All right, that's enough. Bowen Yang, everybody. Thank you.
Comes October 1st.
That's right.
All right, that was a funny moment. And now another poignant moment. Here's Cheryl Lee Ralph giving a powerful speech about believing in your dreams after winning the Emmy for Best Supporting Actress in a Comedy Series. The second ever black woman to win the award and first since 1987.
Endangered species, but I sing no victim song. I am a woman, I am an artist, and I know where my belongs.
God damn, that's a powerful moment. Wow, I hadn't heard that yet. I just pressed play on the clip and listened along with you. Cheryl Lee Ralph. Now, to the speech.
To anyone who has ever had a dream and thought your dream wouldn't, couldn't come true. I am here to tell you that this is what believing looks like. This is what striving looks like. And don't you ever give up on you, because if you get a Quinta Brunson in your corner, if you get a husband like mine in your corner, if you get children like mine in your corner, and if you've got friends like everybody who voted for me, cheered for me, loved me, thank you.
The other nominees must be almost grateful that they didn't win. How the hell would anybody have competed, not that it's a competition, or matched that speech? Woo, that was powerful. Cheryl Lee Ralph. I'm not even familiar with her or the show that she's in, but I don't really watch much TV. But that was awesome. All right, enough from the Emmys. President Biden was in Boston yesterday. He was there talking about cancer research. He said that his Cancer Moonshot initiative is one of the reasons he ran for president. Here's President Biden yesterday.
I give you my word as a Biden, this Cancer Moonshot is one of the reasons why I ran for president. It's part of my unity agenda that I laid out in my State of the Union address to rally the American people to work together. Because we know this, cancer does not discriminate red and blue. It doesn't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat. Beating cancer is something we can do together, and that's why I'm here today.
There you go, Joe Biden giving you his word as a Biden. I guess that counts for something, huh? I mean, it all depends on your reputation, the reputation of your last name. I mean, I don't think that's the kind of thing I'd ever say. I'm giving you my word as a Dominic. I think people would be looking around and saying, what the hell is that supposed to mean? Who the hell are you? What's a Dominic? Fair enough. Those would be fair questions. All right, well, let's get to my interviews. That's what you're here for, isn't it? And don't forget, sign up for a paid subscription. Can't do the show without your paid subscription every day. 2 guests almost every day. And all kinds of bonus content now posting on YouTube, youtube.com/standupwithpete. If you want to be part of our street team helping to promote the show, email me, standupwithpete@gmail.com. But most importantly, sign up right now for as little as $5 a month for a paid subscription. Go to standupwithpete.com or patreon.com/Pete Dominic. All right. Got to find different ways to say that every day, begging for your subscription. I really need to be more creative. Okay, well, let me get to my guest. Coming up, a phenomenal conversation with Bill Boyle. I just don't get how he is so brilliant about foreign policy and history and so much more, but he is. He really does a great job explaining stuff, and he has been very, very accurate in terms of his analysis and predictions as a result of the people that he's reading, studying, and talking to there in D.C. Guy just owns parking garages, but somehow he knows a lot. He's very articulate and great at explaining it. That is coming up, but first, I've got Jared Yates Sexton. Jared, of course, is the author now of 3 very important books. His new book is coming out in January. It's called The Midnight Kingdom, A History of Power, Paranoia, and the Coming Crisis. Of course, he also wrote American Rule, How a Nation Conquered the World but Failed Its People. And before that, The Man They Wanted Me to Be, Toxic Masculinity, and a Crisis of Our Own Making. I love Jared. I love talking to him. I love following him on Twitter at JY Sexton, where he has a massive following there. And I love listening to his podcast with Nick Hasselman, the Muckrake Podcast. Check out all of his stuff. Support him. Let him know you heard him here. And let's do it right now with Jared Yates Sexton. And there is Jared Yates Sexton. It's been far too long, but I've been reading the newsletter, following on Twitter, and listening to the Muckrake Podcast, where we have a lot of mutual listeners. A lot of people love you guys that listen to me. And I want to say a few of them heard you here, so I'm always very excited about that. How are you? Good to see you.
I'm good, and a hearty hello to the stand-up Muckrake combined universe. It's much like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, only not as stale, with a little bit more in-depth political coverage. I'll just say that.
That's for sure, and I'm very happy whenever I get to talk to you one-on-one. And there's so much to talk with you about, as always. But first of all, your new book is going to be out in January, and I suppose that must be, a pretty exciting thing for you right now to be talking about because it's so relevant. The Midnight Kingdom, A History of Power, Paranoia, and the Coming Crisis by the Jared Yates Sexton. Very exciting. And why is that book so relevant?
Well, I'll just go ahead and say, because, we have a history of doing this. Let's pull back the curtain. It is absolutely terrifying to have a book come out. Like, everybody wants to talk. It's exciting. People want to buy cakes. They want to, have parties or whatever. It is absolutely, utterly terrifying.
Why?
It's first of all, the hardest thing I've ever done, period. I had to relearn the entire modern history of so-called Western civilization, over the course of 18 months, to basically try and understand what in the hell is going on. And what I came to discover, the reason why this is relevant is we are tiptoeing, as we've talked about in the past, up to a major epochal moment. There are so many different energies that are clashing right now: liberalism, conservatism, rising authoritarianism. We are, as the old curse goes, Pete, we're living in interesting times. And it's really, when you know the history and when you can take a look at these currents and these cycles, it becomes very, very obvious what is happening, what we're facing, and honestly, what the possibilities are, which is both exciting and terrifying at the exact same time.
If we were going to water our conversation about, or just a conversation about America right now in September 2022, just about, 3 weeks away from a midterm election, my feeling is that the momentum towards authoritarianism and fascism has slowed just a little bit and started to swing back the other way. And we can talk about why. Obviously, the Supreme Court, women's rights, voting rights, and Biden doing good things for people, not to mention what's happening internationally and people seeing that. Do you think that the momentum towards authoritarianism has slowed, and is it too late just because of gerrymandered districts and judges and so on?
The answer to that is yes and no. I mean, a lot of what you're talking about, I think, is sort of the political environment that we experience, the way that we sort of go day to day, right? I'll go ahead and say this. I'll start out with the positive. The fact that the president of the United States of America came out in public and talked about the attack on democracy and actually called MAGA and Trumpism out for what it is in so many words, I think that that's important. And, that shows, we've been talking about this for the past couple of years, Pete, and a lot of us have been warning about what is happening. That for a long, long time was called hysterical. It was called hair pulling. It was, made ridiculous. Oh, obviously our institutions are too strong to fall to this. The fact that mainstream America is starting to understand what is happening, that's huge. That really, truly is. Right. And some of the momentum that's happening within the political and economic sphere is really, really promising. We're looking at rising labor unions. There's a growth of solidarity and understanding. Those things are really, really exciting. Midterms are one of those moments, not just for voting, but also to sort of check the temperature of a country. In a couple of months, we'll have a better idea of how the American electorate is sort of processing this stuff. The bigger problem in all of this, underneath the surface, economically, it's bad. It's really, really bad. And by that, I mean, we're talking about accumulated capital. We're talking about the fact that government and political institutions have been bought off by a wealth class. And we all know that. This is basically the second coming of the Gilded Age. And because of that, what we're actually watching is a very, very quiet drift towards authoritarianism that's happening underneath the surface. And the battle lines are drawn between the American electorate, which doesn't want this. They don't want to be exploited. They don't want democracy to be razed to the ground. And then there's a group of people who are moving the political spectrum closer and closer toward that. And we're seeing that in little signals. What's happening at CNN right now? What's happening in the American press? The fact that Roe v. Wade was overturned, what that means, what it sort of entails, and also the fact that there is no actual plan right now to get abortion rights back in full force. There are a lot of different things happening. There are a lot of gears in motion, is what I'll say. So there are encouraging signs and there are troubling signs.
Yeah, encouraging signs and troubling signs. You mentioned some of them, but you're talking about a gilded, back to like a gilded age. You mean in terms of our political economy, the economy in general? How do you describe that specific? That seems like a very dramatic term to describe a country where a lot of people are doing really well, including middle class, upper class people, especially even subsequently after the pandemic when, we really thought the sky was falling, and it did fall on over 1 million people in terms of someone died and many people lost their job. And apparently 500,000 people are still kind of out of work because of COVID. There's a lot to say about the hangover from COVID, if I'm going to put death aside, but it does seem to me like people are kind of doing better economically. What do you mean by Gilded Age?
Well, to go ahead and put it in a larger historical context, when you have something like a pandemic, it really shifts around sort of power, earning power, where labor power is. These things, these major upheavals, they don't just go away, right? Like one of the things that we're seeing right now is the shift in power moved a little bit from the employers or the corporations to the laborers. And we're actually seeing some, how do I put this? Some rearranging right now. One of the reasons why the Fed is raising interest rates, one of the reasons why they're trying to make people go back to the offices, they're trying to sort of rebalance power, right? On top of that, we have a situation where after decades of hypercapitalism, after neoliberalism has completely sort of wrought a lot of destruction, we now have record inequality. And one of the things that we always see with capitalism is when you have that large gap of inequality, the contradictions of capitalism start to show themselves. So for instance, I don't know if you have enough money to have a private space agency, you're trying to colonize Mars. The next thing is you can't really buy anything else material. All you can do is start buying government offices and politicians. You start bankrolling, I don't know, J.D. Vance or Blake Masters in Ohio and Arizona. Luckily, by the way, they're both bums. That's the real, it's like playing Yates. Sometimes you get all five.
Yeah, well.
Yeah, they suck. And with this, we are starting to watch a rolling back of the progress of the 20th century. We saw that with Roe v. Wade. We're probably going to see that with gay marriage here before too long. We're going to start seeing labor protections go away. We're entering into this new period of this is theoretical, and this is what a lot of people are pushing at this point. They're pushing for reindustrialization. They're pushing for starting to open back up factories. You're seeing this with computer chips and the trade war with China. The only way you can make that economically feasible is you have to start rolling back wages. You have to start getting rid of things like minimum wage. You have to get rid of things like OSHA. You have to start actually rolling back progress. So we're on the precipice of that possibly happening, which we see over and over in history. The question is, can something so unpopular and so controversial, can it happen? And can it go ahead and reach its final point, which is sort of what we're watching right now?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like your point about the ascension of the labor movement, is in contradiction with the point about the concern about these labor protections being pulled away from, torn away, all these things that we've earned. But then when I think about the courts, I realize that that's certainly a possibility. But at the same time, people would be outraged to lose what gains they've made in terms of labor protections now. But certainly they are outraged to lose the gains they've made in terms of voting, in terms of women's reproductive rights. So it's the kind of peeling back of some rights, the ascension of other rights. It really does become an unpopular thing to take people's rights away. And I think the right doesn't seem to realize that, and it's blowing up in their face. And to some extent, I think that will continue. But then I get stuck because every time I think about the progress that we're making together by organizing and working together, I think about those courts, and not only the Supreme Court, but the federal courts and all these judges that people don't realize got put in place by Trump and other Republicans, and the beliefs that they had inspired by this. I don't know how you want to describe this idea of the Federalist Society and their pernicious, insidious, horrible ways of thinking. They just got almost $2 billion more from Leonard Leo. So it's like, it seems like the population is overwhelmingly moving in one direction, progress, but that the courts and to some extent state legislatures are doing everything they can to stop it. How did I do?
Well, you're exactly right. And those courts, the thing is, we think a lot about them in terms of Republican, Democrat appointees. Those courts are always there to protect institutional power. I mean, that's the thing. The Supreme Court has been stolen. We can't talk about this without talking about the fact that the Republican Party stole it. But why did they steal it, and what does it represent? It represents institutional power. It represents wealth. So as a result, the Supreme Court, we can look back at some of these cases that they ruled rightly on. There are triumphs. But most of the time, they are standing in the way of democratic impulses, lowercase d. And in all of this, one of the things that is happening, and this is what's really troubling about it, it is unpopular. And nobody's going to vote for this, and nobody's just going to, be told, we're going to take away your rights. How do you feel about it? What's scary about all of this is when ideology is used to sort of sanctify it. So what we're actually watching right now with things like Christian nationalism, right? Like in all of it, when you say, why was Roe v. Wade overturned? Well, Roe v. Wade was overturned based on control, power, and the fact that Republicans and the people they represent, they want more workers. Like American population has been declining. You have to find a way to start, quote unquote, restocking, right? You always have to grow. But what's the story, Pete? God said to do this. God thinks this is evil. It's capital E, evil. In all of this Christian nationalism, that's what's going to square the circle, so to speak. So basically, we talk a lot about masculinity, right? We talk a lot about like men and how they sort of carry themselves and what they do. Well, the previous generations of men who like labored in factories and mines, my people, my family, how did they do that, right? Like they were being exploited, they were suffering, they lived shorter lives. Well, they told themselves a story. They were doing it for America. They were doing it for God. They were doing it for their family. These are the ideologies that sort of make this happen. So what's going to happen with Christian nationalism, and we're already seeing it, it's the idea that America needs a Christian revival. And as a result, men will sacrifice themselves. They'll take less in pay. They'll go and they'll toil in factories that aren't safe. And they'll tell themselves these old stories. So what's actually happening is this is wildly unpopular. But based on the clash that we're coming to see, these stories are what's going to make it possible to push these things that the wealth class wants to push.
What's your biggest concern in the run up to the midterm elections right now?
I'll give you a couple. One, the Democratic Party, I know this isn't a shock to you or your listeners. The Democratic Party for decades has absolutely been captured by strategists and pollsters and advisors, right? You don't want to seem too extreme. You don't want to push it. You're always going for this, sort of mythical independent voter. And that mythical voter is always a white person in middle America who is afraid of, black people. Let's just call it what it is. Right now they have the advantage when it comes to Roe v. Wade. We've seen that. I mean, Kansas just overwhelmingly protected a woman's right to choose. What concerns me is I've talked to enough Democratic strategists and pollsters who have said you have to press the issue. You have to talk about abortion. And Democrats are terrified of saying the word abortion, right? Because that starts making people think about the quote unquote controversial parts of this. I'm concerned that Democrats are saying, you know what, momentum's on our side. We don't need to do very much. Right. We can just sort of sit back and coast into November.
Are you seeing that? I feel like I'm seeing a lot of candidates hit only abortion.
I think that some are, and a lot of them are strategically doing it if they think that it's safe in those areas to do it. The second part of all of this is I think that the midterms of 2022 are going to give us a hell of a glimpse of what the election deniers and election fixers, how they're going to play a role in all of this. I think the night of the midterms, we're going to see absolute wide-scale Republican denial of losses. And, it's not just going to be the presidential election. It's going to be God knows how many elections that they are going to, throw shit at the wall and see what happens. I am concerned about these people being in positions to affect the elections. And I think that night is going to span for weeks, and I think it's going to be absolute chaos.
Really important to watch what is going on in the next few weeks, and really important to do something, to organize, to work with your neighbors, to find a candidate, to let other people know if you're in kind of a quote safe district that we aren't. So help us out over here. And it's hard for people to know, where to send money or any other type of resources they can. But there are so many different resources for people. And I should probably have a list to say right now. But if you need help, let me know. But obviously, working locally on your own board of education, that was my biggest effort and triumph. Had we lost, I don't know what I would have done with myself. I don't have that much resilience, but it's so important to work locally. What do you see in terms of the schools and what's going on in from Florida to red states across the country. I think this is a huge thing. It's undercovered. Teachers abandoning the profession, which, Jared, they were already years ago. When I first started covering education policy, they were leaving because of the testing requirements and other things that had made the profession not fun and too onerous. And so what do you make of what's going on in schools and local elections?
Well, as a longtime veteran of public education, I can tell you that the profession has been miserable for years. And it's only increasing, and that's intentional. And I completely agree. One of the most underreported stories in this country right now. And really, when you look at it and you understand like how little play it's been getting, it kind of serves as a Rosetta Stone for what is happening in the United States and our priorities. We have a massive teacher shortage in this country. People have no desire to go into these schools. They're being underpaid. They're being overworked. And I want to say underappreciated. That's not the case. They're being literally attacked. And at any given moment, if they're not being run off, they're being called groomers. They're being called pedophiles. They're being attacked. That institution is being intentionally drained of talent and resources. And it's all about a larger point, which the Republican Party has been pushing, since desegregation. They literally are trying to crater public education. And what happens when you don't have enough teachers? You bring in people who, DeSantis is bringing in veterans, right, to teach patriot education in Florida. You start bringing in people who are overwhelmed or overworked. All of a sudden, you start having private companies and Christian universities who start coming in and say, hey, we'll go ahead and we'll write the curriculum for you. Just go ahead and follow the steps. That's where all of this is going. And pretty soon we're going to see a divide between so-called blue state and red state America, where you are going to see, quote unquote, patriot educations in place. And that's intentional. That is part of a long-term, absolutely relentless plan to destroy public education.
Patriot education, or some similar name. It'll probably be more coded than that. Maybe not. I don't know.
They love throwing patriot around. And I just want to throw out real fast, looking at history, Pete, it is constant. It's always this. This is the way it works. When there are counter revolutions, when there are these like regressive movements, they always attack education. They attack teachers. They say they're evil. They're betraying the nation. This goes back, literally into like Napoleonic era stuff.
You could, yesterday was September 11th, and I'm old enough to remember that if you were critical of the reaction to September 11th, any reaction from Bush's rhetoric to the wars, you were destroyed as, and I'm not going to say that the same people are necessarily Trumpers, Republicans. Certainly a lot of them, by the way, are these, quote, never Trumpers. We're still saying that you didn't love America, that you're anti-patriotic because you didn't want to invade a sovereign nation, Iraq, that had nothing to do with 9/11 and destroy the lives of millions of people and a generation of veterans. You were anti-American. And not to mention, your thoughts, how that has changed at all morphed into certainly a lot of those people. David Korn's new book about they've always been these conspiracists and racists. It's not new, but it has become so much more overt and extreme. And now it is, the vast majority of anybody who identifies as a conservative Republican is also equivalent to what today's fascist would be described as, and a conspiracy theorist before you get to the racism and sexism, which is obviously irrelevant.
Yeah, and that's part of what the Midnight Kingdom is actually about, which is these conspiracy theories and these lies have been present since the beginning of conservatism. This is, and that's the thing. Everyone wants to pretend like Trump is an aberration. Trump is, the problem. And if he just gets out of the way, everything will be fine. It's absolutely riddled through with it. The beginnings of conservatism was based on Freemason conspiracies, Illuminati conspiracies, satanic conspiracies. That has always been the conservative movement. Always, 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 because that's the only way, speaking of stories that legitimize things, that's the only way that you can have a hierarchy in which an entrenched hereditary type of power can be in place. This isn't anything new. It just so happens that when the Republican Party enjoys cultural and political power, such as during the Reagan Revolution, right, that sort of rightward movement, they can pretend to care about democracy. They can pretend to care about representative democracy because it's on their side. But what happens with conservatism, the moment it becomes unpopular, and it's historically unpopular right now, the moment it becomes unpopular, they turn to the conspiracy theories and they start trying to actually destroy democracy because they see it as an impediment to what they call natural rule. So yeah, it's absolutely nothing new. It was there at the birth of conservatism.
I got to ask you about the long-term criticism of academia by the right in America. Specifically, what happens usually is it's some loudmouth radio talker from Rush Limbaugh to Mark Levin to Glenn Beck who talk about, or Ted Cruz, academia being elitist, even though they all went to great schools or worked at them. And you are a professor. You've been in academia for a really long time. My question is, what do you hear when you hear the criticism of higher education in terms of we're not talking about the cost. We could maybe save that for another time, but and you guys have been covering that greatly over on your podcast and your writing. But what do you hear as a professor when you hear people say that going to college turns people into a liberal, turns them into these woke people? What does your professor ears hear with that criticism?
Oh, I mean, it's absolute bullshit. I mean, really, the most amazing thing about all this, if you actually look at the history of it, conservatives were totally fine with academia, Pete, until they stopped working with the military to create weapons in the 1960s.
Oh, like, really? That's a thing. I've not heard of this.
The Cold War was basically this period of time where universities existed to study how to manipulate people and also create weapons of war. And then in the 1960s, when all of a sudden a new generation started protesting that idea, all of a sudden conservatives didn't care for higher education anymore. And the entire point of it, and this is actually really important, it's not that public education or universities are leftist. Like, it's literally job training. It's literally getting people ready to go out and join into the capitalistic system. That's all it is. And now that we're talking about wokeism, you want to talk about what that actually is and what it actually means. It's training people to go into the workplace and not create problems with their colleagues, to not say racist, sexist, elitist, ableist things. That's all it's about. It has nothing to do with ideology. It has everything to do with being able to go into a workplace and work with other people. It's completely off base, and the idea that universities are leftist is absurd. They are conservative and at the very, very best, if you want to give them this, liberal institutions, but it has nothing to do with Marxism or leftism. It's an absolute horseshit idea.
It's always weird to me because what high school, much less college, are really about are hearing a lot of different ideas and deciding for yourself whatever I guess you're going to believe in, depending on what you're learning and what kind of criticism it's getting and what kind of group discussion there might be in a class. But you know, I've never heard that connection between the Cold War and weapons manufacturing, much less manipulation. But even if that's, you know, wholly true, that's not what they're saying. I mean, on the right, they're not making that point. They're saying basically when you go to college, they indoctrinate you. And the reason I always thought that it's true, you are indoctrinated into a whole new way, a billion potentially new ways of thinking, because your roommate is from Ohio and uses a different word for soda, much less might be Muslim and pray, you know, a couple times a day, or could be gay, or you met a Jewish kid. Like, I had all these experiences at my little tiny college in upstate New York that I never even imagined I would have with people that I never imagined being friends with. And that changed me. It did change me. I don't want to know. I don't name it, but it changed me.
Well, and I'll go ahead and I'll say what you just described, it isn't leftist or rightist. It's cosmopolitanism. It's coming together in a space and meeting people who aren't from where you're from. This current backlash against higher education, this indoctrination stuff, it's based on this, Pete. It's based on the fact that college has gotten so prohibitively expensive that not everybody can go to college, right? Even though we have a system that almost requires you to go to college in order to be successful at any degree. it's turned into a sour grape situation. I've seen this with my family. I was the first person from my family to go to college. Meanwhile, my family has doubled down on being quote unquote rednecks, even though in the past they cared about education. They wanted to move forward. Now it's like, oh, I can't afford to go to college. I didn't want to go anyway. And what it is, it's a cultural battle between who makes it and who doesn't and who gets to decide. And everything else is just sort of frosting on top of that.
I feel like that's all great, and I didn't want to not acknowledge it. I got to be better in my interviews, but I have these next questions that I always want to move on to, especially with someone like you, which is, and I'm sure I missed it, whether it be on Twitter or I don't think, though, I missed it on the podcast. It seems like you spent a lot of time on the death of Gorbachev, which I think is interesting, but I haven't heard much about the death of the Queen, which seems much more significant from Jared Yates Sexton. Are you a monarchist?
That's the best question I've heard in a long time.
Is that why?
Well, I'll go ahead. I'll give you some inside baseball. The reason we haven't talked about it on the podcast is because my co-host Nick Hauselman has been traveling. We made an agreement that he would go a week without looking at the news. So I am about, as we're talking, we're about a half hour out from me telling Nick Hauselman that Queen Elizabeth has died.
He knows.
And I'm so excited to have that conversation. I will say this. I think that the monarchy is an absolute relic of a disgusting time. I think it represents white supremacy, colonialism, imperialism. Listen, I didn't talk about it a lot on social media. There's nothing to win there talking about Queen Elizabeth. There's literally, there's this weird American reverence for the monarchy. I think it has to do with superstition. It has to do, again, with ideology, trying to work your way through the way things work. I think she's become synonymous with liberalism, which is weird because liberalism was birthed out of a rejection of monarchy. I think it's like a passing of like an age, and people don't want to get into what she represents and who she is. I wish the entire institution would crumble, and I think the world would be better for it.
I do too, but I had a thought yesterday on my own while I was cleaning up my shed. So it wasn't a smart thought, and I'm not a smart person in these ways.
I will say, I think most of the best thoughts about the monarchy happen while someone is cleaning out a shed.
I agree with that. I agree with that fully, which was maybe, and I was listening to somebody talk about it, maybe the Queen, her whole job was to kind of transition the monarchy out, which she did. She had all kinds, she changed all kinds of things, and then obviously many norms did not change, and the whole structure is still there. But she certainly brought it away from being an empire and a colonizer into a more moderate system, or more of a figurehead. You couldn't just, and you can't right now, just end the monarchy in the UK without it having negative effects on and in ways you could never predict. Someone might say, I mean, I don't know, but maybe it takes a little while. So maybe she's just winding it down. She's just sunsetting it. She's not taking the taxes or something anymore. I don't know.
I think one of the really important things, the winding down, I think, is the important part here. Because let's be very clear. Great Britain is in decline, period. And it has been her entire reign.
In what way? Economically, like their strength in the world, their power. I mean, how are they in decline?
Keep going, baby. All of it is absolutely in decline. And I want to point out, this is important as well. They are in decline, and America is in decline. What always happens is you have these moments. You had Pax Britannica. You had the moment where the British Empire was the major power in the world. Then capitalism was like, hey, thanks for all the memories and fish, Great Britain. I'm moving to America post World War II. And by the way, if you actually look at history, everybody was predicting this. They were like, oh, eventually Great Britain is going to lose its power, and over capitalism, it's going to go to the United States. Now it's here. Guess what? I got bad news for everybody. One of the reasons why things are tough in this country, America is in decline as well. There are so many different factors and the reasons why this has happened, but the order that America enjoyed, Pax Americana, if you want to call it that, the American century, it's ending. Look upon my works, ye mighty, in despair. Like, this is not going to last. But I think the Queen, in a way, was a figurehead that allowed people to still believe, oh, look at her crown. Look at all the pageantry. We're still great. There's still something inherently wonderful here. She served as a figurehead that basically allowed them to ignore the decline that was like right in front of their faces. And I don't think it's unimportant to point out the Queen has died We're currently in 10 days of mourning. Meanwhile, Great Britain has no idea what they're going to do for the winter. They're in the middle of a massive energy crisis. Their people very well might freeze to death. I'm talking about like the baseline level of a regime is to keep the people alive with water and heat and energy.
I think you're being hyperbolic. I don't think the British are going to freeze to death. Maybe Northern Ireland.
Well, you want to talk about the Queen and legacies like that? You're exactly. Nobody in Great Britain is going to freeze to death except for the Irish.
All right. Well, let's talk in March to see how hyperbolic you've been, and we'll do a death count of frozen British people.
I'm just saying.
I'm interested. I'm super. I don't know the answer to that. I'm very interested in the energy crisis, as it's being called in Europe. Hearing a lot about Germany and wood pellets, and the bets they made on renewables, and then you hear about the natural gas issue, right, and the Russia obviously war and cutting off the spigot, and then obviously the British too. I mean, it's going to be. I'm going to have some guests on, some experts, but I'm very interested. It sounds quite ominous.
The things that we don't like to talk about in our culture. So everything from energy to, the fact there are people in Jackson, Mississippi who can't turn on their water spouts right now.
Crazy.
It's awful. Every sort of foundational thing that modernity was supposed to have given us, whether it's clean water, clean air, even free trade is starting to fall apart. We're starting to see like trade battles. Neoliberalism is starting to roll itself back. Russia could never invade Ukraine. They would be turned off from the international community. All of a sudden, the international community is like, can we have some gas, sir? Like this isn't supposed to happen because this was supposed to last and last and last. But we're starting to see that stuff disintegrate.
Well, hold on a second. Is that true? Is the international community taking a step back? I feel like they've been in solidarity and lockstep against Russian gas, including where it's unpopular politically for people like the German chancellor. But I'm not paying that close attention. Are they?
The institutional idea that the West would just reject what happened in Ukraine and nobody could ever invade another sovereign country.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they were cut off, quote unquote, from some of the major Western resources. But you'll notice Russia has rebounded economically. Part of the reason is because China gave them a bypass. China's basically like, you don't want to be part of that system.
India is buying, so much of their before that.
Exactly.
Yeah, but Europe still isn't.
So what you're actually seeing is the idea of American hegemony, the neoliberal system that was supposed to be the end all be all, the end of history. We both have heard this, right? Yeah. There's never supposed to be a challenge to it. All these institutions are there to keep it from happening. Guess what? There is now a challenge to hegemony.
Yes, right.
There is now an alternative that is developing. And it's important to point out that Putin and everybody around him, they believe, and Bannon and the authoritarians and the MAGA people, they all believe this. Neoliberalism has reached its apex, and now it's going to get rolled back into something new, into a multipolar sort of traditionalist world. They are right to an extent. Neoliberalism is in trouble. These foundations that we're talking about, like they are starting to crumble. The question is, where do we go from here? What happens next, and who determines it?
It does feel like getting back to, and we'll, I guess, have this be the last one, the momentum that we're seeing. And I heard you and Nick talking about the recent triumphs of the Democrats and the Biden administration in several ways, specifically a major piece of spending legislation that's going to make the biggest investment in renewable energy, healthcare, and so much more. Not to mention this speech that apparently you really like, Biden's speech, and him saying the word fascism and starting to call it what it is. Tell me about your thoughts about the Biden administration and Democrats and the triumphs in policy. Not to mention, I heard you raving. You sounded, you may have been aroused sexually about the college debt loan forgiveness. I heard it in your voice.
I think the college debt forgiveness was not nearly enough. I think it was the right political move, but I would personally erase all of it. I would just do it stroke of a pen. But that being said, I think that the momentum that the Democrats are having, it isn't just that the Democrats are like incredible tacticians. Like a lot of this has to do with the system. Larry Summers has his fingerprints all over all of this.
Yeah.
Larry Summers, who's part of all, again, neoliberal institutions. And you'll notice Joe Manchin came around on the climate stuff after Larry Summers visited with him and gave him the thumbs up.
Oh, is that right? I didn't know that.
Yeah. So what you actually start to notice is these systems basically keep people from being able to do anything until it's necessary or until the system sort of deems it necessary. So the Democrats right now basically have their place as defenders of the institution. They do. I mean, the Republicans are trying to destroy it. The Democrats are saying, hey, hold on now. Let's try and fix this stuff. I think that we're seeing momentum away from Trumpism. And I think that's hugely important. That doesn't mean it's going to go away. It doesn't mean that we're going to escape the worst consequences of it. But I do think if you look at the system and the way that it's working and sort of reacting to this, I think we're seeing that it's understood now that Trumpism, with all of its facets, including economic protectionism that we're talking about, they're starting to recognize that it's dangerous and they need to move away. So I think the Democrats are gaining some momentum, but I'm not going to feel comfortable until all the votes are counted and certified after the midterms. I'll just say that.
Do you think that Trump's going to get indicted?
I think that this system is really good at protecting wealthy white men, particularly former presidents. I mean, to be a president is to break laws. Let's be honest. It's basically the person we put in office to make sure that, we can carry out brutalities.
But some, I always like to say, I completely agree with that. Obviously, the system is broken, but some wealthy white men get caught. Bernie Madoff get caught. Harvey Weinstein got caught, and, two separate kinds of crimes, obviously. But sometimes it happens. And in this case, this time, stealing the documents, having them top secret files.
I will say this, and you've been covering Trump now for years. I've been covering Trump now for years. Every time he does something, we say, how can anybody get away with this?
Right.
How can a crime like this go unpunished? I will say this. If you prosecute a former president, that is a Pandora's box that not a lot of people want to go down, because that starts a whole new era. And you'll notice we're getting ready. I have to explain again to Nick this special master thing. I can't wait to watch his head explode when I bring this up. This is a fiction. It's absolute bullshit that this canon made up, and it has nothing to do with anything. But you'll notice that that system, that judiciary that you were talking about, there's representing these really ridiculous interests and powerful interests. It's just creating fictions now to protect him. It's sort of this thing where Trump has reached a certain level where I don't believe he can be held accountable. I want to be wrong so badly. I want to be wrong, but I'll believe it when I see it.
You think about it, he's always gotten away with things, and a lot of wealthy people have, because they can afford, great lawyers who know how to, take the system for a ride, play it out, litigate till the other side runs out of money. And Trump and his lawyers were always good at finding judges, shopping around, finding the right judge to take the case, appealing, getting it to this judge. But I guess what's different is he got to pick judges as president, but a lot of those judges he picked ruled against him on the election. Supreme Court ruled against him on some things, obviously, as well. But this judge he found, and she gave him special master, which is what he likes to be called, I think, also.
Well, and you'll notice, there are all these things that are sort of popping up. Do you remember it was a year ago, all of a sudden we started talking about the congressional parliamentarian? It's what? Wait, what? What? Who? All of a sudden now it's special masters. There are these little hidden things that just sort of pop up because there are these intrinsic forces that are there to protect wealth and power. And with Trump, Pete, I can't believe we haven't talked about this. He has nuclear secrets. He just kept them at Mar-a-Lago. Yeah. Maybe he sold some of them. We don't even know. There are missing documents. If you or I said out loud that we were planning on taking these documents, we would be in custody before the breath had left our lungs.
It was the best point I heard made is that when Obama was writing his book, his memoirs, he needed some documents from the archives. So he had to go through an official, look, could you get me that a file from when the French prime minister visited? I want to try to remember
Obama.
Exactly what happened there. He had to request specific things so he could write, and he had to go through a process. Trump's put those boxes in the back.
Can we was that your Obama?
Do you want to hear Obama talking to Trump?
I've never wanted anything more.
Look. Don't look. Excuse me. Look. That's all I got. That's all I can do as Obama is look. Look. That's it. Jared, thank you so much for joining me and letting me do my shitty impressions here at the end.
That's incredible. I've not heard your Obama. That is world shaking for me.
Should listen to Muckrake podcast with Jared and what's his Nick. Yeah.
Listen. That's terrible. That's made my day. I gotta tell you, thank you for having me. Thank you for that. That is a gift that's gonna keep on giving.
I'll talk to you soon, buddy.
Thanks, bud.
All right, there he goes, Jared Yates Sexton at JY Sexton on the Twitters, and go listen to the Muckrake podcast. Support him over there. Get his new book and all of his old books. They're so important. Such a great writer and talker. I love having him on the show, and it's been way too long. All right. Well, now another guy I love talking to as often as I can. We talk quite a bit. Good friend of mine, of course. He is Bill B in D.C., and you know him from the old show where he used to call all the time, and then we made him a guest right here on the new show because he's got so much to offer and so much to say, takes in so much information, a real student of history and politics and geopolitics and foreign policy and you name it. Always great to talk with him. He's on Twitter at Bill B in DC. Follow him there. Here we go, Bill.
Wow. What a surprise over the weekend, as well as crazy reactions from across the experts. So I wanted to go to our expert, Bill Boyle. He's in D.C. to talk about what we're witnessing happening in the war, in Russia's invasion in Ukraine. Bill, so much to say. Where do you want to start?
I guess what I would start with is that the Ukrainians have managed to combine their own native fighting ability with, in crazily record time, the sort of weaponry that much more advanced armies are used to using. And by much more advanced armies, I mean basically the United States. They have managed to incorporate our super high-tech weaponry, particularly the long-range missiles we have that are very precise, to completely knock a leg out from under the Russian stool that was holding up their military. And you're watching how, like, dedicated, motivated, smart people can take advantage of somewhat, not enormous differences to completely kick ass. And that's what you're seeing here.
So let's be specific now. How have they been able to pull this off? There's been so much said about how powerful the Russian military is and that they would eventually, it would be a war of attrition. And now you're seeing, I just read something in the Atlantic by Ann Applebaum that said basically we should be prepared for the end of Putin. Not only is Ukraine taking back land they lost, which the history of warfare, I'm sure you can talk about where that's happened, where it hasn't. But now, people like her saying that maybe Putin is going to go as well. I'm surprised to see that kind of speculation. I don't know that you agree, but what do you think?
So first on the sort of military thing that's happened, if you want to know what happened with Ukraine and the Russians, you really literally have to go back to World War II, which is going to sound crazy, but I'll explain it very simply and quickly. During the 1960s and 50s, American generals and NATO generals were looking at how many Russians they had to beat for every guy they had, how many more tanks the Russians had, how much more mass in men, material, firepower they had. And they didn't have a lot of room to back up before they were on the Rhine River and were effectively losing World War III, right? So what they started doing was going and talking to these German generals that fought the Russians in World War II on the Eastern Front. And they started saying to these guys, like, how would you do this? How would you think about this? And these German generals, honestly, between me and you and your clientele, your listeners, kind of bullshitted the Americans and said, well, we would have done a lot of things very differently, and this is what we would have done. What it came down to is that you need to strike the follow-on forces, right? Meaning the Russians attack you with an armor division. It's not enough to just beat that armor division that hits you right in front. You have to keep its follow-on forces from being able to get into the fight by hitting them with air power, with Apache helicopters, with long-range missiles, etc., so that you only have to fight them in detail rather than all at once. Well, that can be turned around on offense as well, right? If I'm fighting you in, say, Kharkiv, Ukraine in 2022, if I destroy the links between your reinforcements and your supplies, it's called deep battle. If I can destroy those links, then I can defeat you in detail through each echelon, right? First I get your front line, then I get the secondary, then I get the third. And Ukraine's been doing that policy that kind of came, or that strategy that came out of Americans and British talking to German World War II generals. They've been using these long-range precise missiles to destroy the links between the Russian supply and Russian reinforcement to their front lines. And they've been doing it all over the place. It's not just in Kharkiv. So the Russians have been faced with a situation where they're losing men. They're trying to attack. Their artillery ammunition is disappearing, which was their big advantage because it's being blown up in these huge ammunition dumps. When they try to bring reinforcements to the front, they're getting whacked by precision missiles. When they try to launch an attack, they can't bring follow-on forces in because they're getting hit when they try to follow in. And so, as you and I discussed last time we talked about this, they were losing four to five men for every one they killed on the Ukrainian side. Now, Russia is bigger than Ukraine. It's not 5 times bigger than Ukraine. And
right.
In manpower terms, Russia probably has 175,000 men in this fight to fight a completely and fully mobilized country of 44 million people.
Right.
They just don't have the manpower. And they can't use their mass because the Ukrainians, being helped by us and this sort of military pedigree that thought of this idea, has been destroying their ability to employ their mass. And so what you saw in Kharkiv was the Russian front is mostly just kind of a hard crust and then a really soft and chewy interior.
It's like a blow pop.
It's like a blow pop, a
or
very
Tootsie.
badly tasting blow pop. Yes. And so what happened is that once the Ukrainians kicked the front door in, they could run all through the house because there was no one there to stop them. You know, normally if the Russians have attacked, when they did attack Ukrainian lines, they hit the first echelon, and then when they try to exploit it, they whack right into the second echelon of defenders. And it's defense in depth. And that's why the Russians expended millions of rounds and were getting like a kilometer a day. The Ukrainians have exerted 1/10 of the Russian force, and they took back like 5,000 square kilometers in 3 days, right? It is precision, intelligence, and morale against dumb mass that has too much terrain to cover than it's capable of covering.
And winter
is coming. Winter is less of a problem than the muddy season. So in the end of October, it's going to start to rain and it's going to get wet and muddy. And this, by the way, has a lot to do with the timing of this offensive, which, by the way, is not just in Kharkiv. It's going to be down to Luhansk. It's already starting in Luhansk right now. And Kherson on the west side of the Dnieper River is also, that's not a feint. They are doing a different kind of battle there. They're attritioning the Russians to death, but again, have used the deep battle tactics to cut off their manpower, supplies, ammunition. I mean, there's word that in Kherson, the Russians are running out of food and water. That's 20,000 men on the wrong side of a river that has 2 broken bridges. So the Ukrainians that actually gets at another thing is the Ukrainians are doing 2 different kinds of battle, right? One more attritional, another one, mostly about movement. At the same time, about 800 miles apart. But those battles are interrelated because the Russians needed to send a lot of men and a lot of ammunition to hold on to Kherson. That made it impossible to support what happened in Kharkiv. Now that Kharkiv is falling apart, now the Russians are racing everyone they can get to Kharkiv, and they can't really support Kherson. And this is, the term would be the horns of a dilemma, right? When you're winning a war, you're forcing your opponent to pick which really shitty decision he's going to have to make.
Yes. They don't really, that's what I've been reading. They don't really, they're in a real dilemma. They don't really have good choices right now.
It's in boxing. If I have a really good jab and I've got a really good inside game and I can, pick you off in distance because I've got a great right hook, you don't have any choices except how much punishment am I going to eat to try to survive to the round, right? And that's where the Russians are right now. They are in profound trouble. Now, if there's a lot of people in Washington who would hear me just saying what I'm saying right now, and they're going to say, oh, well, the Russians are just going to go mobilize, do general mobilization, and that's going to be the end of it. That's not going to work.
What would that be, general mobilization? What does that mean?
General mobilization is these guys are contract soldiers, right? Which means they have a term contract. When the contract's up, they can go home legally. unless there is a declared war, they can say fuck off and they can walk back to Moscow. If you declare war, then you can say no, stop loss is instituted and you can't just leave. And then you can go out and start conscripting people, doing a draft in Russia.
Got it.
Russia does not, in the Soviet times, Russia had this incredibly large and well-funded, at least in Soviet terms, system for doing it. They got rid of all of it. They don't have the barracks, they don't have the rifles, they don't have the boots. So the idea that they're going to do a general mobilization is kind of absurd. And guys like Michael Kaufman, who's a famous military guy, he's like, they don't have the infrastructure for this anymore. That's number one. Number two, what somebody like Tim Snyder would say is that, Russia is not fascist Italy. It's not fascist Germany. It's not about fascist mobilization. It's about fascist demobilization in the social sense. In Russia, they don't want you enthusiastic because enthusiasm is hard to control, right? And so all of Putin's regime has been always about atomizing everybody because it's hard to control a movement. It's easy to control a bunch of people who are individuals. And believe me, there are Russian nationalists. There's a guy named Igor Girkin, who is a Russian nationalist who's out there. There's the Prigozhin, the Wagner guy. Those are the private army that Putin uses. Those guys would love there to be an intensely nasty nationalist movement to seize power. So if you're the Kremlin, you can't take the risk of mobilizing people because there are a lot of incredibly nasty right-wing nationalists who would take advantage of it. At the same time, you're not going to ever get the manpower as what you're doing now, ever. It's never going to be enough. Let
me play from MSNBC. He was on Morning Joe, Admiral James Stavridis.
Sure.
Here is his analysis. I want to see if you disagree or if you'd add anything. Frankly, I prefer parking garage owner Bill Boyle than the former head of the Supreme. I don't know. Here he is, Stavridis. You've been on with me many times, but here he is on Morning Joe.
I think they're very significant, Joe. And, you reach back and look at other wars. Think about the Korean War. At the beginning of that war, the North Koreans had massive advances, pushed the South Koreans and the U.S. allies all the way to a tiny corner of what is today South Korea. The landing at Incheon kind of came around behind them and created a new circumstance on the battlefield. So, yeah, I think this is pivotal. We'll know more in the days and weeks ahead, of course. But 4 quick points. One, tactically, this is really hurting the Russians in all the ways Mika mentions, but also it's the loss of manpower, the loss of morale as they watch this unfold, the Russian troops. Operationally, what the Ukrainians have showed us is they can conduct a complex dual front, if you will, offensive set of operations using combined arms very effectively. Thirdly, strategically, think how this is playing today in Beijing, where they're in preparations for the big meeting with Xi and Putin and how this is being portrayed there. They're going to try and make it look better than it is. And then fourth and finally, and I think most obviously, huge psychological uplift for the Ukrainians. Look at that flag flying. Look at the faces of those people. As one would say about war, the morale is to material, the equipment as 3 is to 1. This is a pretty good moment for the Ukrainians.
All right. What would you say? Would you add anything to that, Bill? Would you disagree with anything? What about that Beijing point, Putin and the leader of China meeting?
Yeah, I would tell the Admiral he'll be happy to know that the parking guy gives him an A+ on that. I think it was totally solid.
He'd be very flattered.
I'm sure he's waiting with bated breath on the feelings of the transportation industry of Washington. But the point about China is quite good. China has to be furious. Xi has to be furious. I keep an eye sort of on what Chinese social media is talking about this whole thing. And there is like enormous derision popping up all over Weibo and the other Chinese social media networks about Russia and what complete clowns they are. It's bitter. It's deeply embarrassing. Remember for Xi that a year ago, he signed up for a no limits partnership with Russia. Well, when he did that, he wasn't assuming that Russia was going to, completely shit the bed in Izium. And for China now, they've got a lot of really bad choices because they need our trade far more than they need Russia's trade. But they also need a strong, or at least not, end of the Ottoman Empire style partner, geostrategically in order to compete with us. They thought that was going to be Russia. And obviously Russia is more likely to be, the rotting, declining, imperial narco state to their north.
Right.
And that's not good for them. It's really bad for them. And, and nobody really ever talks about, I get annoyed when I hear people say, China, they have such a long view of history, which is really kind of borderline racist and bullshit. But when people tell you that and say that, they never talk about how long and bitter Chinese history has been with Imperial Russia, right? Like Russia came in and kicked their ass and took all kinds of things from them for 200 years up until 1905. Okay? If the Chinese have such a long view, don't you think they're looking at Russia and thinking, someday, asshole, we're going to get you back for that? So I think it's causing there's a lot of reasons for China to want to be on Russia's side or to want Russia to be a junior partner. But there's also a lot of history there that goes in another direction. And Russia right now is showing itself to be a less than awesome ally. Let's put it that way.
Wow. Absolutely crazy what is happening
there.
And that last point that he made, it's hard to illustrate relief, happiness of people who thought they were going to die or who lost many people of their own family. But I mean, basically what we saw were people who had been occupied, liberated.
Oh, yeah.
Those are the moments in history I wish we could capture more. I mean, nobody knows it happened. Yeah. I've just started paying closer attention, but what an amazing thing to see. And I'm not saying nobody saw that coming, but it's nonetheless, it's a really big deal.
Well, we're in a position or in a timeline or a moment where a lot of people were doubting the ability and efficacy of liberal democracies, right? The people who jumped up and down and told you it wasn't worth it, Russia was going to win, this is all bullshit, and we're just wasting our time here. They tend to be the people on the far right and the far left who are not big fans of liberal democracy.
Yeah, you shared a tweet from this woman, Mariana Budrin, who writes, it's not that most realists and pacifists knew little about Russia and even less about Ukraine. It's that they didn't even care to learn. They could just take a look at Russia and see a great power, take a glimpse of Ukraine and conclude it's weak and worthless. I might have indulged in a bit of straw manning, but not much. I do hope, however, that both realists and pacifists could take a hard look at Ukraine today and use it as an opportunity to learn in earnest, revisit their assumptions, gaps in understanding, and ethical commitments. Arrogance and self-righteousness is no way to go through life. It's also no basis for advocating policy that can make or break a people about whom you know or care next to nothing. Wow.
Right. And that's great because she gets at how so much of the approach to this was driven completely by people's own personal ideological predilections, right? Did Tucker Carlson give a shit about Ukraine or Russia? No. But Russia has this sort of government that appeals to Tucker Carlson's affinities, and so he was on Russia's side. Greenwald doesn't love Russia, but at the same time, he's like, if the U.S. is supporting this, then it's bad, right? Like that. So many people are driven in the analysis of these things by just their own immediate biases. And what's wild about it is, for the super history nerds out there, I've been talking since this began periodically about the Russian-Polish War of 1919 to 1921, where there was a thing called the Miracle on the Vistula, where the Poles just absolutely crushed these enormous Russian armies. No one thought they could do it. Everyone said Russia's bigger. They're going to kick these guys' asses. And guess what? In similar ways to how Russia is losing now, they lost then, and that was 102 years ago, 101 years ago.
I was going to pick a conflict in between now and then, which is it's not ridiculous for people who've been paying attention, our age, to see American intervention in the world militarily and say, well, this is not going to work. But it's probably better to somehow differentiate where America gives money and support versus boots on the ground and actual Americans. And I was just thinking about how the last time we really succeeded in this way, fighting, I think it's fair to call a proxy war, was in Afghanistan against the Russians in the 80s.
Yeah.
And now it's the same country and the same, not the same, but it's a proxy war where we're giving money and funding, in this case, Ukrainians. And in that case, it was the Mujahideen, obviously. And one might argue bin Laden came out of that and so on and so forth. But I don't see these dots necessarily connecting. I don't know. What do you think about the comparison and just the proxy wars that America has fought, where we've succeeded, where we failed?
It's pretty straightforward. If you are supporting a large enough population that is defending itself from an invasion from its authoritarian Russian neighbor, and you are smart in how you support them, and if you are careful in how you support them, chances are they're going to beat the Russians. That's just it. Because the Russians really don't match up well against American military know-how. Remember, we've been thinking about how to beat the Russians since 1946. We have not been thinking about how to beat random, people in the mountains of the Hindu Kush for more than 20 years. Right. And even then, we never really, it was never a vital interest for us, ever. Whereas making sure we know how to beat the Russians has always been a vital interest in the United States, really, honestly, since 1917. So there's the U.S. has bent a lot of effort and spent a lot of time thinking about this. And if you look at the American military systems that are just wreaking havoc with the Russians, the thought process for this stuff began in the 1970s, 60s, right? So the problem that I think that people have is, they don't look at Ukraine and go, this is a country even with a flawed democratic government that's being invaded by its big, nasty neighbor that's run by mobsters. They don't look at it that way. They go, who thinks this is good and who thinks this is bad in sort of my world on Twitter or in my own domestic political world? And then they go with whatever they think is going to get them a lot of clicks or get them a lot of votes, and that's it. Right? There's nobody's trying to, I think that you're analytical about it for sure. You didn't immediately come out and say, well, I 100% support either side. You took a little while to think about it. And not, literally you took like a week to think about it, but you still you didn't have like a knee-jerk reaction to it. And you questioned me a little bit about it. And that's good, right? That's the way you should do these things. It's also how you win as well. I think the U.S. being graduated in its support, in everyone screaming we should be giving them jets and fighter planes at the beginning. Well, they look a little dumb, right? When really what's winning this war is the artillery system that nobody knew existed, who wasn't an expert 6 months ago.
The other thing that I'm fascinated by with these conflicts, any war, is the incentive to fight and win. Americans in Afghanistan and Iraq, Vietnam much less, didn't know why they were there, didn't have a good incentive to fight and win other than for each other, the guy next to them. That's what I would hear from this generation of veterans, almost to a person. But in this case, your country's been invaded. And
exactly.
And so they have all the incentive. And you talked about that, and anybody paying attention or talking to any Ukrainians understood that. And the Russian soldiers still don't know why they're there. And so I feel like that's tough to measure, but I feel like it's probably one of the most important factors at play in this and any conflict.
Well, it's what Stavridis said, and I've been reading it. I believe it's Clausewitz, where the moral is to the physical 3-1. I believe it's Clausewitz who said that. Napoleon said some other version of it too. And those chaps knew what the hell they were doing. You look at, for instance, a couple of weeks ago, there was a report that the Ukraine, actually, no, it's more like 2-3 months ago, before the HIMARS really kicked in and started wrecking the Russians. You would read, and I would talk to people in D.C. about, the Ukrainians are losing 100 men a day, maybe 400 wounded a day. And people would say to me, this has to stop. The Ukrainians just this is awful, awful, awful.
Yeah.
Because Americans are so unused to losing people.
Yeah.
Because we haven't fought in a war that is existential since 1945.
Well, I would argue that the death numbers coming out of Vietnam, the Vietnam War, for my dad and his generation certainly were impactful and motivated people, not to mention obviously a draft. But those were, those were, dozens a day, sometimes more, and that affected Americans. It doesn't seem to have affected the Russians. I don't know if it's not getting to them, but obviously, you're making the point of how different it is for us versus these other countries.
Yeah, and how, like, for Ukrainians, that 100 a day is not politically impactful because they're fighting an existential war. And you look at the Russians in Afghanistan. The Russians in Afghanistan over the course of, I don't know what it was, 12, 15 years. They lost fewer men than the Russians have lost in 6 months in this war.
Is that right? Wow.
It's in a country, by the way, that at the time was, I don't know, 190 million people, 200 million people, because it was the Soviet Union. So pound for pound, they're getting absolutely pasted in this war. And the war in Afghanistan is the most proximate, obvious cause for the end of the Soviet Union. Right? I mean, that really is what did it for them. Because they realized they couldn't win this war. They got stuck in it. It just sapped their military power. It froze up their sort of ability to reform their economy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what you're seeing now is a similar sort of thing happening. And I don't know if you've seen it, but now 18 districts, and I believe it's Moscow, like local government districts, asked Putin to resign.
No. Wow.
Yeah, no. I would say two things about that. Number one, don't overread it, but don't underread it either. Don't overread it in the sense that I don't think that there is a revolt happening tomorrow in Moscow that's going to overthrow Putin. But what I think is good about it or interesting about it is it's indicative. These folks are in government in Moscow. They are connected to the power vertical, even if tangentially, which means that they are starting to go, I can get away with saying this fucker Putin's got to go. Right? It was only like a couple of them a week ago. And yesterday, I think it was 18 districts said it.
Right.
So there's clearly at least the perception that the regime's grip is weakened. And so I would call it a ripple. I don't know if there's a wave behind the ripple, but the ripples are happening. And again, we go back to mobilization as we discussed before. If you're the Russian government, you're starting to see that, and you're not even mobilizing anybody yet in Moscow, St. Petersburg, Ryazan, the core. You're not even mobilizing those people yet, like the way you are the Buryats and the Kalmyuks and everybody else. So if you're not even mobilizing them yet, and they're already saying your ass should be thrown out, people are starting to have the temerity and to take the risk of saying that.
Yeah.
You're not going to do general mobilization there. You can't. Or you may try, and then you'll be like, Kerensky in 1917, and the people that you recruit will take those nice rifles you gave them, and they'll decide to have a new government.
Is that what happened?
I'm certain that's literally what happened in the Bolshevik Revolution. Is that the soldiers that were supposed to defend Moscow, there was almost a military coup, and the soldiers that they mobilized using the Bolsheviks to get them to help them, they ended up overthrowing the regime in favor of the Bolsheviks. If you're Putin and you know that people in Moscow hate this war, don't want to fight it at minimum, when you start handing them rifles, you don't know how that's going to turn out, right? They could very easily turn those rifles at you. So I think it's dangerous. I think it's super dangerous for them to do the things they might do that could help them gain some initiative again. I think that they are not, their options have become quite limited.
All right, before I let you go, two more quick questions. What are your thoughts on the death of the Queen? What are your thoughts on monarchy, the royal family? Anything about that?
My feeling about the death of the Queen, she seemed like a pretty tough old bird, did the job as well as you could. But, I come from the Irish tradition where there's a joke that people make. It's living next to a country that enormously reveres its monarch is sort of like living next to a country that's obsessed with clowns and hangs clown stuff everywhere and constantly talks about clowns, and they care what clowns, eat for breakfast in the morning. But the weird thing is that the clown, his clown grandfather killed your clown grandfather. Right? So, hey, I hope they love enjoy their clowning, as they say, but it doesn't do much for me.
Yeah. Well, I forgot you're Irish for a second.
Yeah.
And what's the rumor about the former disgraced President Donald Trump being in your town, Washington, D.C.?
Oh, God. I mean, people are fucking ridiculous. I mean, I saw all that last night, and I mean, they're like, he looked disheveled and was wearing golf shoes, and that tells you that he's really in trouble. And I'm like, This guy has been a disordered sociopath his entire life. Are you really looking at what shoes he's wearing to try to figure things out?
They're insinuating he got pulled out of bed because he's been indicted or something, right?
Yeah, I mean, the legal people that I follow were like, that is the dumbest thing I've ever heard of my life.
And if he's probably there meeting people he's trying to grift and raise money for himself.
Yeah, exactly. He's got like a golf course, Trump, whatever, out in Virginia that he goes to. And, I think it's only weird in that he was sort of secretive about it. But again, he has to know that, he does know the Justice Department is now looking at all of their political operation to see how much of it is like what Bannon was doing. And so Trump being secretive about raising money, he's a mobster. He knows that if he shouldn't be blatant about it if it might get him in jail. So.
Thank you, as always, my friend, for talking to me. I love your perspective on all things, and so does everybody else. We appreciate it.
Sure. And one last thing. There's an estimate that there are at least 40,000 Ukrainian troops who are uncommitted yet. Don't be shocked if round 3 is a hell of a surprise.
Around what?
Round 3 of this generalized offensive might be a legitimately, truly shocking development.
Got it.
Maybe they decide to hold all those guys in reserve, but if they decide to try to run the table, you could see some really crazy things.
Ukrainian soldiers are handing out surrender cards to Russians.
Oh, I love that, right? That's such a smart move. So smart. So smart.
They're in the cards,
and they're spreading rumors that different units are in Kherson are trying to negotiate surrenders. I would bet you, Pete, and please don't, cut this out of your Russian affiliate when you send it there. But I bet you money that nobody is trying to create a surrender. But the Ukrainians are saying that just to put that in the Russians' heads. Their information operations are amazing, really smart. So
yeah, they're doing a really good job.
Yeah,
taking advantage of.
Don't fuck with Ukrainians. What's that?
And you got to give the Biden administration and Secretary Anthony Blinken and the State Department, as well as the Defense Department, a lot of credit too, the way that they played this early on. And
this is going to be up there with. In the same way that nobody ever gives George H.W. Bush credit for handling the end of the Cold War, which he should get an enormous amount of credit for handling that, Biden will go down in the history books of people like me as having done something equally amazing. And also he'll get no public credit.
Maybe.
That's just the way it works. That's
Sleepy
the way it
Joe.
Works. Sleepy Joe, who is utterly fucking up the Russian imperial project and the Chinese one, for that matter, all at the same time. And people pretend he can barely get out of bed in the morning. It's amazing.
Really interesting, that Chinese angle. All right, sir. Thank you as always. Really appreciate it.
All right, buddy. Awesome.
Man, I love talking to that guy. Bill B in D.C. What do you know? A lot more after listening to him. Go say hello and thank him on Twitter at Bill B in D.C. And let me thank you for listening to today's show, as well as Jared, Yates, Sexton, and especially those of you that have paid subscriptions. If you haven't, sign up now. Go to patreon.com/PeteDominic. StandUpWithPete.com. Either way is the place to go to sign up now. That's all I got for you. Looking forward to talking to you tomorrow. Let me know who you want to hear on the show. As always, email me with your ideas. You want to be part of the street team? Would love to have you. Sign up to follow or subscribe on YouTube, which is free. YouTube.com/StandUpWithPete right now. And you can watch some of the highlights, some of the clips chosen by listeners themselves and posted up on the YouTube page as well as everywhere else. On social media, I exist on all of them. You name it, I'm there. Even Be Real. Okay, I don't have a Be Real account yet, but apparently I'm supposed to get one. That's a real thing. Be Real. All right? So be real, whatever that means. I love you guys. You're the best. Be the change you want to see in the world. And I will talk to you right here tomorrow. John Carroll, take us out, brother.
They'll keep right on ignoring us if we keep sitting tight. You got to open up the window to let in some light. You got to stand up. That's right. We got to rise up. You got to stand up. You got to stare the devil straight in the eye. We got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear and all you hear is a lie. So get up off of your butt, get down off of your fence. And even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you lay stand up. They had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of a stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for loss, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up. We got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up. You got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well, and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.